demonstrated that China was doing better than the rest of the world combating the pandemic. But then the World Cup started and China saw swaths of people in the stands, maskless, enjoying games. Let's welcome in geopolitical risk analyst Scott Moskowitz to continue this conversation. Hey Scott, thanks for being on the show. Just want to ask you first and foremost the significance of these protests and what they tell us about how China has enforced its COVID policies.
Yeah, they're really significant. I think you're just seeing a lot of pent-up frustration. And in terms of significance, people think China is a place that no one ever protests. That's not true. There actually are a lot of protests day to day or month to month, but they tend to be isolated and sort of atomized from each other. People don't tend to know that they're going on. And the big difference here is that you had protests happening simultaneously around the country in different cities, and people were aware of them and they were drawing inspiration from them, and there was a sense of solidarity. So that is something really new. That, and especially the expression of direct anger at the central government and even at Xi Jinping himself, almost unheard of.
And of course that, as you said, being unheard of, a lot of people are going to be watching this around the world. So in response to these protests, is it more likely that the Chinese government will further ease restrictions as they have recently, little by little? Or do you think we'll see the government crack down harder and become more authoritarian to send a message to these protesters?
Well, it's a really tricky situation. Certainly, like you said, the world is watching. And one thing is, China actually is often responsive to protests. Protests do often make things happen because they don't have the safety release valve of democratic elections. So instead, people pursue policies in this way, and sometimes they see change. But with all of the world's eyes on China right now, Xi Jinping is in a very precarious position where, he wants to diffuse the situation, but he doesn't want to look weak. And you could see both. You could see a lessening of restrictions. At the same time, you could potentially see a very violent crackdown if that doesn't appease the protesters and they don't go home. So it's really a tense moment.
Oh, yeah, that's for sure. Now, as I mentioned there, some have called for the president to step down. Now, in a communist system like China's, where she has also we should mention, just secured another historic term as the leader there, how likely is political instability in the country?
I would say at this stage, it's pretty unlikely. One of the things you mentioned, he just secured a third term. Not only did he secure a third term, but he also kind of pushed any of the last sort of checks on power, any person who might have stood in his way or contested him out of senior leadership positions, and appointed a slate of loyalists. So the only time you really see something like this that could lead to true political instability is when the party is split and you have competing factions. As you have occasionally in the past. And right now, she's in a pretty strong position within the party. It's just, if he can ride out the storm with the public, that remains to be seen.
Sure. How much of a factor do you think the World Cup is? The Chinese population witnessing massive crowds playing in the protests, and there you have, certain cities on total lockdown at some time.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I can't say for certain, but, people in China like soccer. It's pretty popular there. No doubt people would normally be out in the streets. I've spent time hanging out at bars and big public spaces watching the World Cup when I lived in China in the past. It was a big party, and now there's no party in China. And at the same time, they're sitting home at their TVs watching the rest of the world have a party. And it's notable. One of the things you heard at protests, one person protested, there was a slogan, somebody yelled out, "I just want to go out and watch a movie." That was one of the statements. I mean, some of them are these very bold statements of political action, and some of them are just, I just want to get back to my normal life like the rest of the world is. So I think you're right on there.
Sure. And Scott, finally, I want to ask you one more question here. Why does China have such a strict COVID policy, this zero COVID policy? Yes, it's a communist country. They can literally lock people inside of doors. You could get away with that in other countries. But what are they so scared of? Is it their healthcare system or the lack thereof? What's fueling this very, very strict policy at the end of the day?
Yeah, at first it was uncertainty, like everything. It was their healthcare system. But part of it is the political system. Once they put sort of all their eggs into one basket, it's not the kind of system that rewards you for walking back any policy and saying that you are wrong. The way the party works is they claim to be right about everything. So to suddenly change the policy would be to admit that maybe this wasn't as scientific socialism as they call it. It wasn't quite as scientific as they claimed it was. And that would really start to throw into question the broader legitimacy of the party to always be right and lead the party, through every decision. And so it's very politically tricky if it's maybe outlived its use as a policy.
Well, Scott, so many different ways this can all pan out. We'll have to wait and see how it does eventually. Scott Moskowitz, thank you, sir, for your insight. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.